right now. So without further ado, I would like to dive into the content of the session. I think we can all agree that we want our food systems to function and operate according to the best scientific knowledge and practical knowledge available. But we can also agree that documenting this knowledge and publishing research papers doesn't really deliver on the full-scale food system change as we wish to. So how can we deliver our solutions and knowledge to the right arenas? And how can we get ourselves heard and also get as many people on board as possible to tilt the scales towards the sustainability, equitable solutions and inclusive food systems that deliver healthy diets for everybody? These are the questions that we hope to find some answers to today. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Today with us, we have Anneli Sundin, who is a communications officer at the Stockholm Environment Institute and the lead for the Agriculture for Food Security 2030 program. We also have Michael Victor, who is the Director of Communications and Knowledge Management at the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI. Also with us today is Lei Win, who is a journalist with over 10 years of experience covering issues of development and sustainability, including her work as a food security and climate correspondent at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And Judy Matu, is Judy with us? Has she joined already?
I unfortunately cannot see her, so I hope she will join soon.
Yes, let's hope for that. But Judy Matu is a chair lady for the Association of Women in Agriculture Kenya, AWAC. She's a chair lady and a community organizer there. So let's get to know our panelists a bit better. I'll start with Michael. Michael, you have an extensive experience working with science communication, working with water and land management and forestry. So why did you choose this as a career path, and how did it change your life? And maybe you could also tell us a bit about the trends that you have observed during your career over the years.
Hi, thank you, Katja. And thank you for can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello, okay. Okay, that's a little bit better. It was kind of echoing. No, just thank you for having me here. I was actually reflecting on the question, and the question actually makes me realize how old I'm getting. I didn't really think I was old until I got this question. And I mean, one of the things, what has changed, which is funny, is, you know, I think when I started and maybe some others here started, we didn't have any, you know, digital gadgets, any smartphones. We actually, I think I did my first training in Peace Corps in Nepal using mimeographs. So copying with those blue photocopiers with the handheld things. And I think, you know, my experience really stems from that, and where I'm really kind of, my passion for science communications and communication really comes for when I worked in Peace Corps, you know, as a volunteer. And after I worked there, really trying to understand, you know, living in a rural area and understanding the context in which development kind of happens, not just doing development, but seeing how it kind of comes in from the outside. And after that, I worked for a forestry project looking at community forestry, and one of my mentors was a kind of a famous professor from Yale University who was really excited about the potential of community forestry, not just for sustainable natural resource management, but really for getting at the heart of democracy, equality, and decision-making at its lowest level. And so we went out and started evaluating some of these groups, and we're listening and learning from them and really seeing kind of local development, local decision-making, and democracy in action. And I think that really got me excited to really learn about facilitation aspects of group dynamics, how communication really plays a role in providing access to information to members of the group, and issues of power and how voices are heard and getting those voices out to the policymakers and to the donors at different levels. You know, this experience really kind of helped me see that like where I was probably most effective at was in communication rather than maybe in local development. And I really learned the power of listening and building upon what people needed and were interested in. And, you know, for me, that was like at the heart of this community forestry experience. And I spent most of my career for the first 10 years really working on community forestry and natural resource management. And this real idea that of, you know, participation, devolving things to the local level and really having local people take control of their own lives and allowing them to do that. And I think when I first started, what has really changed is that when I first started in communication, it was all about local voice, really making sure that you were, you know, building upon local needs, that you were devolving things to the local level, you were making sure that local institutions could support themselves. Participatory communication was a new thing back in the 90s, and using new forms of communications to really allow people to tell their own stories. And access to information. Or the internet, where people didn't have much access to information. And I think that was, you know, the kind of the three principles that I really grew up on. And I think that's kind of changed today. I think, you know, first there's three differences probably. And I think we've seen there's a lot more complexity in what we're trying to communicate. You know, right now we're not just communicating a story of what's happening in the field, but we need to find these hooks, you know, whether it's on climate change, social justice. Nowadays with COVID, we lose sight of, you know, I think sometimes of what people are on, you know, what's happening on the ground. And we have to frame it in a different area. So that's a little bit different. I think there's a lot of channels and information access, and that's become a really big issue now. And, you know, so how do we get our message out above the noise? How do we see things? And how do we actually, you know, it's not just putting out a message on Twitter, but how do we know who we're engaging and trying to influence? There's so many different levels, there's so many different target groups. So really trying to focus much more. Mm-hmm. And then finally, there seems to be a lot more issues about focusing on development tools, you know, advocacy and convincing and communications for resource mobilization. One thing I do note that I think is interesting is discourses are changing. And we see with food systems, you know, this new discourse moving away from food security, healthy and sustainable diets. And I wonder if that kind of these new discourses that are a bit more global will lessen the focus on the real issues that are happening at the local level. We see that with livestock where, you know, plant-based diets are really becoming popular, but you know, in the South and in developing countries, where we're working in Africa and Southeast Asia, you know, livestock plays an incredible role, both for livelihoods and diets, as well as for resilience. So we need to be able to understand the differences still. So those are really where I see the...
Thank you. These are great points, and I can actually relate to that. Not many communicators actually know that they want to work with communications before they start getting into it. And I think Anneli is one of those communicators as well. So Anneli, I know that you have a degree in resilience science, but you ended up working with communications anyway. So how did this happen? And what do you like about it? What do you enjoy about it?
Thank you, Katja. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you for, it's a delight to be part of this SIANI annual meeting today. I'm very happy about that, and to get to listen to the audience and to the other experts here in the panel. Super exciting. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I have a background in environmental science, sustainability, resilience, but I actually have SIANI to thank for getting onto the path of science communication work. I'm it's around 8 years ago, I started working with SIANI as a communication assistant. And that's how I opened up my eyes for science communication and the role that it plays. I mean, Michael summarized that really well, I think. I've always had an interest in smallholder farming and smallholder farms. I think it's because of my background. I come from a farmer family myself. And it's really something I have a passion about. What can I do to help the smallholder farmers around the world from here? And you know, working with communication, it really gives you a chance to see some real outcomes. And I think we need Michael mentioned these participatory approaches in communication. I think that's something we need a revival of because it was very present many years ago, but now the trend is going in the wrong direction.
And now you're working with Agri4C program hosted by ACI. You're leading communications for that program. Could you tell a bit more about this project and how do you use communications there?
Absolutely. Yeah, so that's what I will be referring to quite a lot in this panel. I think this Agriculture for Food Security program that I'm very lucky to work with communication and engagement for. What the program does is focusing on capacity building of researchers in our partner universities in specific target regions of the world. We're focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Because we see that there is this problem of a lack of resources, a lack of time. There are many barriers for university researchers to engage with policy and practitioners and other relevant stakeholders. So we're trying to provide opportunities to train and improve skills around communication and how you reach out to and who you reach out to and how you reach out to relevant stakeholders, and creating, you know, we have this, we call it that we translate science and existing science. So we're not actually doing new science in this program. We're translating, synthesizing, analyzing and translating science so that it gets adopted by relevant stakeholders. And we do that through creating these meeting arenas or forums for stakeholder engagement. And so, as you will hear me talk, communication and engagement is a crucial part of this work. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anneli. And now I want to hear from Thin. So Thin, I think anyone here who works with food security, agricultural development read your stories. I certainly have. And I'm wondering, have you always wanted to illuminate the topics of food and climate? And why is it important to you?
Thanks for the question, Katja. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And thanks to SIANI also for having me here. So I don't know if you know or other people you know, attending know, but I was born and raised in Burma or Myanmar, however you want to call it. And Myanmar was and still is an agrarian country. So I grew up with this abiding affection of farming and farmers because we grew up with this knowledge that that's where our food comes from. And this is how, you know, we sustain ourselves. So even though I was brought up in the former capital in Rangoon, I had this affection on agriculture. And I also happen to be a massive foodie. I love food. I love talking about it, cooking, eating, watching shows about it, and of course, reading and writing about it as part of my day-to-day job. But what I started out actually about 13 years ago was covering humanitarian issues. So that includes things like disasters and conflicts, refugees and displacement, women's rights issues. And what I've noticed, throughout the years was this interdependency between weather and climate and food production. And in fact, one scientist that I interviewed actually called this relationship and unhappy marriage, because weather and climate and food production are so, intricately linked together, but can also and are often quite antagonistic towards each other. So I think if you care about food, and I do believe the right to food is a fundamental human right, then you should care about climate change, because food production is so influenced by changes in weather. And I do see those two things as incredibly important for humanity. And now, of course, you can do that in many ways. For me, that is to sort of cover this issue and to focus on this issue, hopefully, for the next few years.
And what are the key narratives in this discourse, do you think, now? And what do you think, where is it moving?
So, I agree with what Michael said earlier when he talked about this whole debate and discourse around food security evolving. It's no longer just about hunger and famine and malnutrition that occurs only in the poor countries. So there is now widespread acceptance that malnutrition exists in rich countries and that obesity happens in poor countries. And people are seeing nutrition no longer as a health issue, but, talking about these sustainable food and diets. And people are realizing that food security is not just about poverty, but inequality, environmental destruction, and biodiversity, all these linkages. So the debate is no longer limited to calories and yields anymore. And there's talk now about taking a systems approach. And I think it is a good sign that the debate is sort of becoming larger. You're looking at it from a bigger lens. And I'm sure everybody in today's meeting have heard about this term food systems very often in the last year or so. And I think that is where the debate is heading. Like I said, I think that's great. And I think it's needed, particularly because COVID-19 has shown how fragile our food systems are, how supply chains snap at the smallest pressure. But what it also means that it is a much more complicated, interconnected system. There are lots of actors, lots of interests, lots of stakeholders, and that is not even taking into account what Michael mentioned earlier about suddenly having so many different channels and different groups and issues to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you're describing a very complex picture. There are so many different actions, as you mentioned yourself, many different topics and narratives. But how do we communicate this complexity without excluding important voices and without oversimplifying things?
Well, the short answer is that you try and approach it with great care and do the best you can, while being very aware that, you won't always get things right. I mean, for example, again, referring back to what Michael said earlier, this whole argument about changing diets, right? About eating less meat and more plants. And of course, it's very nutritious to eat a lot more fruits and vegetables and nuts. We know that. But the issue isn't as black and white as it has, I think, so far been portrayed, at least in a lot of the reports and research and media stories that's coming back, particularly from the global north. And I think you really need to think about nuance and context in these issues. There are so many countries that are eating more meat than what experts say is necessary, that there are also many other countries who are eating a lot less, where in those places, animal-based products could really improve their nutrition levels. And not every country in the world or community in the world actually have access to, varied fruits and vegetables and nuts, so it depends on what's available. And again, I guess another example I could talk about perhaps is trees, right? We like to plant trees, reforestation is big, we like to protect trees, but what if, these forests or trees are the only source of food and income for this particular community? What then? Mm. Or you have a reforestation strategy, but that is all about monoculture, right? So in a way, it's a lot harder, particularly, for example, when I was working for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we follow the Reuters guidelines. For spot news stories, it has to be around 400 words. How do you inject those nuances and context in a short article? It's really hard. And I'll be the first to admit that we don't always get it right, but I think it is worth trying. I guess to close off your answer, I just have two requests or comments to fellow communication professionals at this meeting. One is Please, please train your researchers and scientists and officials to speak clearly and concisely on the impacts on the ground of what your project or report or research is doing. It's not easy, but there are ways to get good sound bites without having a massively long caveat about, if this happened, this will happen. If that happened, again, I understand the complexities, but it's something that I think that needs to be improved. And the second one is something that I try to do as a journalist, but I think it could also really be helpful for communication professionals. And perhaps, if Judy does come back, I think she might touch on this point as well, is this whole issue of representation. And it really matters. For example, if I'm writing about, stories on Africa and Asia, I try to make sure that I quote at least one expert from these regions to show that, poor Asians or Africans, they're just not victims. They're not just waiting for help. There are a lot of expertise there. They're, from the ground up. Like one of the most recent articles I did was about the Great Green Wall, which, suddenly got a cash boost from the One Planet Summit when President Macron announced that. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't just talk about, oh, there are Western donors giving money to Africa, and here are the poor people who will benefit. Luckily, I was able to find two experts, one born in Niger and one in Burkina Faso, who was able to give this on-the-ground experience. So again, I don't always succeed, and sometimes time is a pressure, but I think it's worth trying.
Thank you. And speaking about the science communication and helping scientists to speak about very complex and not black and white topics, and topics that need more research, as we often hear in their message. And Michael, how would you suggest approaching that? Are you muted, Michael?
About that. Yeah, I put an article from kind of just to add on what Tin was saying from Nicholas Kristof, who wrote a really great article about saving the world, and what we as communicators he thought we could do. In terms of like concrete examples, I'll tell one story about how we kind of communicated successfully some of this complexity. And it gets into this issue about the discourse between plant-based diets and livestock. And I think many of you will know about the Eat Lancet report that came out about 2 years ago that really, tried to provide guidelines for a global diet and really kind of promoted the plant-based diet. And in the paper itself, they really did recognize the importance of livestock to local livelihoods, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where people aren't even getting enough meat or protein from what they're, from meats and from livestock. But the press picked it up, and of course, everyone has to, get rid of livestock. Everyone should move to a plant-based diet. So they really kind of turned it inside and out. And what we did was we have an initiative to really try to improve investments in sustainable livestock. We don't think all livestock is good, particularly in the West and the industrial livestock. But what we wanted to show is the differences of how livestock makes a difference and why it matters in the developing world. So we put together some messages, and we worked with the Minister of Livestock in Ethiopia to develop an op-ed. And he wrote that op-ed. And again, by giving local voice to a global issue, he would put this op-ed in actually Thomson Reuters, from where Tin used to work. And this op-ed maybe wasn't in the Guardian or the New York Times. It got picked up, and it got picked up by the Italian ambassador to the World Food Program, who actually then said and blocked the World Food Program from adopting these guidelines, and said that, we really have to take into consideration what role livestock plays in the developing world. We can't just have these global guidelines. We have to have granularity. So when we talk about communicating complexity, we have to, and working with our scientists, I've come up with 6 principles that I've looked at, and I just wanted to kind of quickly go over those. So the first one is about the messenger. When we talk about communicating complexity, people trust different types of people. So, there's a lot of studies that have gone on that show that people trust scientists who are at the academic, at a university, more so than they would trust a public scientist working for CDC or something nowadays. So look at who's your messenger, and that's what we did with this op-ed. The second one is, how are you appealing to people? Is it about hope or is it about despair? And again, in this Nicholas Kristof article, you'll see they start saying that, people actually are convinced when it's about hope. It's not just despair. Maybe Greta Thunberg kind of, shakes that up a little bit, but, for the most part, studies have shown, if you're showing that you're saving 250,000 people, that's very different than saying, oh, there's 1 million people in a refugee camp. So again, look at that. Are we trying to inform or persuade? I think that's a really important part as a science communicator and as a researcher who's doing communication. We really should be informing, not trying to persuade. And that's what we try to do in the livestock debate. We're not going to take on Impossible Meats, and we're not going to take on the really anti-livestock coalition, but we try to inform and provide evidence. The fourth one that comes up a lot is disclose uncertainties. Don't be ruled by uncertainties, and don't be ruled by this idea of obfuscation, which is the practice of making things unclear or confusing. And scientists and science communicators can often do that. But do disclose uncertainties. Let people know what they are. And I think one magazine which I've always loved, I don't agree with what they say all the time, but is The Economist, because they're very upfront with things and what they're trying to say. And that gets into the fifth point, is state the quality of your evidence. And I think it's really important to make sure that you say where your evidence is coming from, be transparent. And again, studies have shown if you disclose uncertainties, if you state your evidence, people will start to trust you and trust the sources. They can make a differentiation. And then the final one, and maybe this gets into this whole issue of, we're living in the fake news world and what is real and what is not real, is something that they call pre-bunking. And you might really want to really think about how you pre-bunk, someone saying this is fake news. And this requires, anticipating potential misunderstandings or disinformation attacks, and really stating those, and means understanding the concerns of the audience. So I think, when we're trying to, communicate complexity and whatnot, that's really important. Maybe those 6 points can help people. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. These are, I think, very valuable.
Can I just very, very quickly, Katja,
sure.
That op-ed that Michael mentioned by the minister, I know that very well because it came to me. And I just want to put one point. One of the reasons we looked at it, and we get a lot of pitches for op-eds, both solicited and unsolicited. And one of the reasons why we said yes immediately was because it was so personal. He talked about how he grew up there and, what livestock meant to, it was not full of jargon or official speak. You read as if it was coming from him as a person, not just as a minister. And I think that's one of the reasons why it worked so well. And it went everywhere, so many pickups.
Thanks so much, both of you. I think this, as I said already, very valuable points, and I will make sure we summarize it in writing as well after this event. But I want to hear also from Anneli, and from your experience on the program level, how do you implement communication and match this theoretical knowledge with the goals of the program?
Thank you, Katja. Can I just also comment on what was just said very quickly?
Of course. Yeah.
Michael was mentioning how you have to decide whether you're informing or persuading. Today, in the last few years or 10 years, there's been a lot of talk about using storytelling as a means of communicating science. And in storytelling, that's what you are doing, you are persuading. So I wonder, maybe that's something for Michael to reflect on, and he can come to that later. That's something that I'm very interested in. How do you use storytelling in a way that is not, where you're still nuanced and critical, but you might have some elements of persuasion in there. That's just a comment. But then, on your question, Katja, so I want to really take the opportunity to promote the method that we are using, or the approach we're using in the Agriculture for Food Security program. We're just embarking on a second phase of this program funded by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. And in phase 1, we started using theory of change, which many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. It's an old method, I would say, among several other different tools for evaluation. And we, now in the second phase of this program, we're using theory of change across all our projects, but also on a programmatic level. But the most important is how we work with theory of change on a project level. And this connects to communication. I'll get to that. But for you who are not so familiar with theory of change, we will talk a bit more about that in the workshop part in my group. But theory of change is all about understanding and exploring what is it that you want to change, what is your desired outcome that you want to see in your communication, in your initiative, in your project. And in order to understand that further, you need to do a situation analysis and understand the current context. And then that will take you automatically to do this stakeholder analysis and understand who is it that are influencing the change that you want to reach, and where, and what do you need to do. And then you start to map these, which usually when you do this, theoretically, it looks quite pretty visually. You start mapping change pathways. And then those pathways, that's when you hook in with, excuse me, communication and engagement strategies. What are your interventions that you think would enable you to reach that pathway? You might not, you might not reach the final desired change that you're looking for, but it will help you a good way on the way. And of course, there's monitoring and evaluation and critical reflection to be done on top of that. And this is a completely iterative process. And I don't want to spend too much time to talk about it theoretically, but to give you an example, we worked on a project, which is one of my favorite projects because it concerns a type of livestock that is trending here in Europe, but it's been a traditional part of diets in many other regions in the world, that of edible insects. As we worked with researchers at universities in Zimbabwe and Democratic Republic of Congo to promote edible insects. And that meant we looked at the whole value chain, and they did a theory of change that was very, in the end, quite complex, and it evolved throughout the project period. And it has now created so many how can you say, so many outcomes and taken so many different directions. But one thing I want to bring up is how they easily got some endorsement. So the research team is based in Chinhoyi town at Chinhoyi University of Technology in Zimbabwe. And they involved relevant stakeholders from the very start, which is the point with theory of change. You need to engage with some stakeholders when you do your situation analysis and you map your change pathway. And they managed to get endorsement from the mayor, mainly because he and his colleagues, they were all quite nostalgic around edible insects. They've eaten that since they were small, and they've seen this trend away from edible insects, especially in urban areas in Zimbabwe, which there's a yuck factor involved, and you don't want to eat edible insects to the same extent as I don't know, maybe 20, 50 years ago. So we got endorsement from the mayor, and that really helped a lot. So to connect emotionally with relevant stakeholders is also really important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks so much, Anneli. And I hope that many of you can join us in the workshop and hear more from our panelists, and where you will have also a possibility to talk with them about their things that are working and not working, and ask your questions, maybe get feedback for your communications efforts. But now I would like to switch to the Q&A with the audience and ask Linda to help me with that a bit. What's happening in the chat?
Could I just add on a little bit from what Anneli said? Just to kind of add some things. I think it's great, you know, like she said, about the theory of change, and it's, yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So, you know, I think it's great what Anneli said about the theory of change. And again, I think there's two things I wanted to mention. One is, you know, it's really important about how we link to scientists and how we engage with scientists. So, you know, the theory of change is really a way to engage with the project. And I think one thing about that is, you know, for science communicators, is to look at the outputs. What are the outputs in that kind of theory of change or that outcome logic? And, you know, build your communications around those outputs and those moments that things are coming out. And then you can link to, like she said, to the changes that they want to see done. I think one other thing is, when you're working with scientists, remember, not all scientists are alike. And there was a great CCAFS, the climate change program from the CGIAR, that did a study on looking at the different types of communications and social communications. And what they came up with was a typology of scientists and how you work with them. And they came up with three. And basically, there's the scientist who's the rock star communicator. I think we're in Sweden, so we could talk about Johan Rockström, you know, and him getting up on his TED Talks. And you don't need too much. You just need to amplify and support them. So that's the rock star scientists. And then there's the middle scientists. They might be the younger scientists who are keen and eager to really do something. And those are the ones you really want to target, because those are the ones you can really influence, you can support their capacity, and you can really get buy-in. And then there's the scientists who are real scientists and on the spectrum, you know, they don't want to communicate to anybody. They're doing their work and they're really intent on it. And it's really important to respect those people and then just do something for them and then show it to them. And not, you know, not get them through this whole rigmarole of participation as well. So segmenting and targeting your scientists and understanding how they, you know, react to communications is very important as well. Over.
Yeah, I think these are amazing insights. I think, yeah, I totally agree with that, and with comment also how everybody has to be on social media now, for instance, but some people don't, and we shouldn't push them to be. So I think your classification is very relevant in this case. But I really, really am eager to hear from the audience now. And Linda, can you tell us what's happening in the chat so we can respond to some of the questions?
Yes, we have received some questions in the chat, and people are sharing different interesting links that everyone can look up. And we have a question for Anneli. It's from Joy Jamago. The question is, I consider music, dance, poetry, photography, social media, vlogs, blogs, essays, stories, etc. are communication venues or media. Have you used many of these to achieve your goals in your projects and programs? And which ones are the most effective? And then we have a question for all the speakers, if they can share some concrete examples of where they have succeeded in their communication work. And then people also want to know a bit more about theory of change and where to learn more about this.
Mm-hmm. I think that I would invite everybody to also respond on the visual side of communications too. So we can start from Anneli and then go to Thin and then Michael.
Okay, thank you. I am a big music and dance lover myself. So actually, I've never thought about using music as the proper medium for communicating science, or neither with the dance. So thank you, Joy, for inspiring. Storytelling is big. Where I work at Stockholm Environment Institute, we are always trying to find what is the story, how can we tell this, and how can we tell something visually with photo stories. So I definitely recommend that. They are very digestible, and you can easier connect if you also connect to how it actually looks like in that context that you're describing. So if you see photos, I would also really recommend, that's something I've learned the last few years, only to recommend to use media much more. And maybe Thin has a lot of contributions here. I think we pitch way too little to media, and I think there's lots of opportunity there, which I'm starting to discover now. And there's so many different channels and different target groups. So of course you need to do an analysis of which channels are the most appropriate, but I would definitely recommend all of us to use media and reach out to the ordinary citizen that way. I'll stop there. I have some more points, but I can give the floor to others.
Thin, would you like to come in and respond to some of those questions?
I guess just to, follow up from what Anneli said about, reaching to the media. It is, obviously, I'm slightly partial because I'm a journalist. So I would say, yes, great, do it. Having said that, you've got all these, again, you've got lots of new channels now, social media, all of that, where the media is no longer the gatekeepers. For a very long time, we were the gatekeepers to get messages to ordinary people. We no longer are. And I think by and large, I welcome that and I appreciate that, because I think gatekeepers, the whole idea of it, I have issues with it, that, a group of people control what goes in and out. Having said that, I still think there's been a lot of studies that has shown that when it comes to big issues, people still go and look at what journalists and the media is saying, particularly trusted ones. And a lot of it is, somebody with considered independent with some sort of specialist knowledge. But I think, like Anneli said, you need to do your homework first. Really need to, because I used to get about 200 emails a day, on a good day, sometimes longer. And I only really have, less than a minute, a few seconds to actually look at a pitch, a press release. So you need to, and a lot of the times I'll just look at the headlines and go, well, we don't cover that. I don't cover that. So it just goes straight into the bin. So I think you really need to do your homework to see who you want to pitch and how you want to pitch it. And I think it's a bit more work, but I think you will get a lot more bang for your buck, essentially, if you do that homework first. And all you need to do is just do it once. Yeah. What are the big newspapers? What are the big news agencies? You can count with one hand the news agencies that pretty much almost work like the wholesale list, right? Like Reuters is one of them. Mm-hmm. The broadcast media, what are the online sites? And then, you can tailor it. The journalists will be grateful to you because you've done half of the work for them, but you are also likely to get a lot more response. I mean, I have a lot more tips later on, perhaps during the breakout session, on how to write press releases and how to do pitches. But I think the first rule is just do your homework, because otherwise all your efforts will go to waste, because the journalists will just be like, yeah, this is not relevant to me at all.
Thank you. And I would like to hear from Michael. Maybe, Michael, you can talk a bit more about pictures and representation in our work, how important that is, and how can we do a best job there.
Okay. And I think this, one of the things I just wanted to add in here, and I'll go back to that as well, is I think we also have to remember as communicators, our profession and the process that we use is a science unto itself. So communications has methods and tools, and it uses analytics to understand what we're trying to do. And I think for me, it's really, really important that we continue to show scientists that we have a process as well, that you need to do your studying as, you know, and you need to do your homework, whether it's in a theory of change or whether it's understanding the hooks and the messages you need to apply to, like Tin and Anneli said. We need to understand our audience. We need to define our objectives. We need to go out and prototype something and test it and get feedback. And from that feedback, you actually start to then provide evidence to researchers or to your boss about, no, we're not going to use that red, or we're not going to use what you said because no one understands what it says. We did a great thing in Laos where we went out and did testing of different types of research things that, you know, scientists wanted to do. We found very quickly that farmers in Laos, at least, didn't understand what a table was. So if you put something in a table format, they couldn't understand it. You had to write it out. If you put in the Latin name, you know, in parentheses to show that you know the Latin name, it turns farmers off. They feel like they're stupid because they can't read the English language. So it's those things, these tidbits that we learn through testing that help us improve and help us to provide the evidence to show this is the way we go about do things. And then providing, you know, again, I think one of the big problems that we have in research communications is just like scientists, we're great at producing things and we're terrible at disseminating things. And we're terrible at getting those analytics. So yeah, I mean, and that gets into maybe some of this issues about representation and diversity. And it's too bad we didn't have our other panelist on who was really going to give a view from the farmer perspective. But I think, you know, more and more we're seeing with ethics of photography and communication, you know, moving to Africa for me after living in Asia for so many years, really important that you're telling that story from the African perspective and again, giving voice and not representing Africans. And I think in the old way of the poverty and, you know, it's all drudgery. There's a lot of interesting things going on that you know, to really show that, you know, that Africa is one of the most dynamic continents in the world. And, you know, how can you show that and, you know, represent that in your work? And I think that's really important that we continue to kind of really think and about the ethics of some of the pictures and some of the images that we're using.
Thank you, Michael. I think the point of the science of science communication is really a music to my ears, and that there is a lot of, you know, there is a lot of science in this area of its own. But Linda, can we go and have another round of questions from the audience now?
Yes, we have one question from Mark Ritchie. He says that nowadays repetition of lies is a way of some to mold their own truth. And even evidence-based truth are being muted because of this. If we aim just to inform and not to persuade, how could we counter such lies embedded in narratives and discourses? That is not, it's directed to anyone who is willing to answer that question. And then we also have Maria Sachs, who shared in the chat that Voices for Change is a platform for cultural and media activism where they amplify voices of rappers and other artists who works strategically for awareness. So there are many different ways that we can move on with the communication. And then we also have a question from Syed Shah that is directed to Thin. And you think we're talking about changing diets and how that can help in food security. But how can we apply that at a public level? If there's anything we can do with communication to change that.
Thanks a lot for the questions. I think this is the issue of like fake news and misinformation and reducing trust to scientific knowledge, because everybody can just talk what they want is an issue that we discuss between each other a lot, and we struggle with itself. And I would be very interested to hear what do the panelists hear about it, or what do the panelists think about it. Sorry. And then, Theme, perhaps you can take your question first. Are you muted?
Yes, I've just unmuted myself. Yeah, thanks for the questions. I mean, really interesting, fascinating topics that I grapple with daily as a journalist as well. You know, let's just first start about the changing diets. I guess, I mean, one concrete example I will give is was it a year and a half ago or something like that? I did this big package of stories called Death by Diet, which was essentially about six stories, I think, and one very long form article that I coordinated and wrote about how our diets are actually killing us because of the heavily extra processed food that we're eating, or sometimes just not having enough of micronutrients, etc. And I went back to Burma, my home country, because, you know, we have had this whole history and pride as being one of the rice bowls of the world, because we are the rice producers, you know, during, I think, in the 50s or the 60s. And there's this whole idea of, you know, trying to get that glory back. In Burma, even in terms of greetings, you know, we don't say, have you had lunch? We say, have you eaten rice? You know, so it is so much embedded in the culture that that's all you eat. And there's very little nutrition, you know, obviously in rice, because if all you eat is just you know, massive amounts of rice. And I went to, you know, some of the farmers and spoke to them in the central of the country. And it is also really interesting. So part of it is culture. This whole idea of just eating a lot of rice, but also part of it is this perception that, you know, eating more vegetables. Vegetables are for poor people. Fruits and vegetables are for poor people, and meat and, you know, good rice and grains are for rich people. So having to change that perception to show no, this is, you know, not just about health, but this aspiration, right? That this is actually what you do, you know, it's just eating meat and rice is not just about this perception of being rich and poor, because they're like, oh, well, you know, if you pay this much, you could get meat. Why would you eat vegetables? That's for the poor. So I think there's so much that you can do in terms of public communications to, you know, raise awareness and educate and sort of change some of that very long held perceptions. Not going to be easy, but there is, you know, and I know that there's lots of things that are currently being done in Burma with the FAO and at IFPRI and a couple of others to try and actually do proper campaigns. And if I'm not wrong, GAIN, I think, is doing something in Africa about how cool it is to eat vegetables. And they've and this was something that they were announcing. I don't know if the campaign has gone off, but it was very funky, you know, posters, colorful, as a way of sort of trying to associate eating healthily with being cool and superstars. And, you know, so again, like, you know, getting, like Anneli was saying, getting endorsements from some of the big names that people look up to. I think that's the only way. And, you know, the government has to be involved. It can't just be the media or the NGOs or your organization doing it. It needs to be top down from the policy level, that this is going to be what they're going to encourage.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a great example. It's so interesting, isn't it? How our food is connected to our status, like social status. But I really want to also speak in the time that we have briefly about this misinformation and reducing trust to science because of the media, or is it because of the media? And Anneli, would you come in and talk a bit about that?
Thank you. I think I'm not the expert here on how to deal with misinformation and fake news. I think Michael and Thin, and this is such a shame we don't have Judy here.
But what do you think in general? Just your impressions as somebody who works with communications. How do you feel about it?
No, it's of course, it's really, I really liked the examples of that Thin was bringing up. It really makes sense to try and have campaigns that really turn to the ordinary citizen, that speaks the language of that citizen, in order to get the message across. If you're battling a lot of misinformation in that stream, if we call it that, then you have to get your message across. And using those kind of campaigns, I think, is really, really impactful. I think also that I think we should use the role of the influencers in social media today. I've seen that in another project. We've been using public figures, influencers, famous people talking about environmental issues in a video campaign for Facebook. And it's just so much more effective than if we would go out and talk about it. And these people, we prepare statements for them and so on, but they are the ones who take that statement and make it their own and talk in a way that the public will understand. So I think influencers are a really cool way to reach out with your message as well. I wanted to give an example. When Michael brought up this example of Laos, made me think about how powerful social media is in Southeast Asia. In one of our Agri-Frosse projects, we worked on sustainable goat keeping and connecting goat to markets, or goat producers to markets. And this project started off with a lot of training and developing training material that farmers could understand, but it also entailed starting up a Facebook group, and it's just been so effective. That Facebook group has more than 4,000, I think it's even 5,000 members of farmers who are now, through the Facebook group, learning a lot about how to more sustainably keep your goats, and how to feed them, how to take care of sick goats, etc. So for them, Facebook has been essential.
Mm. Yeah, I also think we shouldn't underestimate the power of Facebook and LinkedIn groups. But thank you so much, Anneli. I'm sorry to push you a bit there, but I think you did really well. And I want to hear what Michael thinks about the trust issues that we're having in the sector now.
Yeah, I mean, to just build upon what Anneli said, I think I think one of the things we haven't really discussed here is the whole side of engagement. So we talk a lot about communication and communicating messages, and it really is about, I think, building trust, and it's about reaching out to different groups to be able to develop that kind of dialogue. And I think that's something that we're still missing. Again, our job, I think, like Timothy is saying, is if it's not necessarily to persuade, but it's, how do we inform, and how do we develop kind of a process to engage and create these dialogues to better kind of create these linkages to different groups. I think, like Anneli said, for me, it's also the messengers. So, oftentimes the influencers or, someone like Dr. Gebre, how do we make sure that it's, you're working with the right people to get the messages out? And I think, again, that's the whole issue of people are much more interested to see someone they know, or to hear it from somebody else that's, that they think is more believable. So I think these are really important ways that we can go about doing it. I think it's something that we haven't really, in the livestock world, we're dealing with the issue, maybe not so much of misinformation, but again, of granularity. So not all, this black and white type of issue. So how do we add some nuance to it and provide people with a better idea of why livestock matters in different contexts, and why it might be better in Sweden or America to, have a plant-based diet. So those are different, I think those are two different issues. This misinformation one is very difficult to tackle. And again, it's very different in different contexts. So, in Myanmar, it's going to be very different than it is in America. And you have to know what that means, misinformation, and whose side you're dealing with, in a sense, as well. So it's not just a kind of a blanket area. Over.
All right, yeah. That's That's fair points. And in the last two minutes that we have left, I want the panelists to share what do they think is missing from what we are doing now. What do we need to do more, and what we are not doing enough? It would be really interesting to hear, where do you think we should focus our efforts more? And we start with the theme.
I'm muting again, sorry. Oh, good question. Obviously, again, being very partial, please bring in the journalists, see them as your friends and collaborators. We will ask tough questions, at least a good journalist should. And we might not necessarily always write just, what you want us to write, but I think it's really important to build that relationship. And just very briefly, like what Timothy said, it's really hard to combat the kind of polarization that we see. And I think for me, just from a very small way, when we talk about food security and climate change, at one point covering climate change was pretty controversial, and now some of the topics along it are still controversial. But I've decided, and within journalism, there's this whole idea of being objective, meaning having to show both sides of the story. But I think at some point we've just decided that, hang on, there are some things that are just truths. Climate is changing, and a huge majority of scientists agree. Hunger is bad. Everybody should have access to food. I am sorry. I'm not going to interview somebody who says it's okay to have this. So I think there is also this need, perhaps within the media industry and the journalism, to look at what exactly does being objective mean. Does it mean whether just purely giving everybody, a paragraph each, even though one side might just be arguing in complete bad faith?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it's a very important issue, and some people are trying to portray it as problems with the freedom of speech, but really it's a difficult discussion about who do we give the right to speech, and where the right to free speech is harming other people. But Anneli, would you like to tell us your final points?
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting. Yeah, I want to push forward one message that is something that I think of almost every day, and it connects to what we've been talking here about theory of change and how you design good communication. But it's something I bring with me from the AgriFOSE program. In the first phase, a lot of focus were put on producing these so-called policy briefs. And we, in the communication and engagement team, at the end, we got almost sick of these policy briefs, having to edit them and publish them, when what we needed to start thinking about is beyond that brief. We even have a webinar on the topic, by the way. You need to plan ahead, and you need to think about, okay, what do you want to do with this? If it is a policy brief that you need to write, that you think is the best format, you need to have a plan of how to use it, or how to make sure that it lands on people's desks or are read, and that where the key messages are crystal clear, and where people really actually adopt those key messages. So I think planning your outputs, planning a communication campaign around your outputs. What can you do more than just a policy brief? You can do a video, you can pitch it to media, you can do a podcast, whatever. Just think about beyond the brief, what are the next steps, and how can you advance your communication. Thank you.
Thanks, Anneli. I also can agree here, and totally agree with what you said, that the policy brief is not the final answer to everything. And finally, I would like to hear from Michael. Michael, what are we missing? What should we focus on more?
Actually, the solution to all our problems are just e-letters. So if it's not the policy brief, it's the e-letter. So
yes.
Deal with that. But seriously, I guess I'll just go back to something that I kind of referred to in the beginning. I think, and maybe it's from my perspective as, you know, working in an organization, I think we have to keep science communications as science communications and focused on achieving outputs and, you know, like achieving impact, like Anneli's been talking about with the theory of change and whatnot. There's a tendency, I think now, maybe it's just my, you know, the organizations that I've been working for, but using communications as a resource mobilization tool. And I think this gets back to this issue of, you know, trust. If communications in organizations is only about resource mobilization, then you lose your trust because you're just trying to promote something to get more money. And I think we have to separate that out, you know, resource mobilization and communications versus science communications and engagement, informing, and in advocacy. And I think this is something, at least I see a trend moving communications more back to this kind of classic resource mobilization effort. And I worry about that because I think we'll then miss all this rich information that we just talked about, as communication is a tool. Again, getting back to what I just talked about, you know, communication is a tool for good, communication for development. And, you know, now that we're in Sweden, there is a great course at Malmö University about communication for development that I used to take. And I think it's something that, you know, a lot of us here probably feel that communication is a force for good and for social justice and whatnot. And, you know, let's keep to that rather than using it as a way to get more money and to promote our organizations.
That's great final words. Thank you so much, Michael. And now we're running a bit over time. So I would like to invite everybody to have a little break, go have a coffee, and let's meet here in 10 minutes.